pikespeaksddc.org.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Jonah Wish. I'm here with the National Cybersecurity Center. I'm going to give you a talk today on cybersecurity governance. Wish that we were all here in person so that I could share this with you and ask or answer some questions when you all have that in the audience. But for today, we're going to pretend that, and I'm excited to see what you say when you join online after today. So first I'll give you a little introduction into my background and into my life. So I lived in Colorado Springs for a couple of years. I just recently moved to Omaha, Nebraska with my wife. You can see us here. This is Garden of the Gods here. This is our Christmas photos or holiday photos from last year. And so yeah, we just moved to Omaha. Before that, went to school at the University of Pittsburgh, got my undergraduate degree in exercise science, and then when I moved to Colorado Springs, I'll avoid sharing the long journey from exercise science to cybersecurity management. Despite the differences, there are a good amount of crossovers, especially when it comes to risk management. So I'll relate that today. The big overlap there is when I worked in sports science, the biggest lesson you learn there is that you can't predict what's going to happen based off of averages. You can't say tomorrow that guy's going to get injured or tomorrow that team's going to lose. You can only make your best guess. And so that's a lot of what cybersecurity governance is making good judgment based off of the best estimates you can get. So I'm in school here. I'm going to graduate next year with an MBA in cybersecurity management from University of Colorado Springs, along with a graduate certificate, and just getting some letters next to my name there. Have my Security Plus certification, and continuing towards some others as well. So let's get right to it. As you're viewing this presentation, some things to consider, and I would ask some questions of you if you were actually in the audience today, but think about the type of business that you are. I know here we're talking about small businesses, but even within that category, you're going to have a lot of differences in terms of hardware and software needs, in terms of the type of business operations that you're running. So just start to think about that and how technology and information and the value of that information plays into your everyday business operations. Your number of employees, the structure of your organization, if you have a designated IT staff, if you completely outsource all of those needs, just start to bring all of those points back into your brain here and think about that context. Have you thought about the risks to your business yet? Is this something that you're just walking into and starting to think about? Do you have established plans and protocols for different things, for incident response or for just dealing with day-to-day business operations as it relates to cyber? Even though we're only talking about small business here, everyone is going to be a little bit different, but we're going to talk about a framework that can fit for everybody within that in that category. So as you look at this slide here, I want to just start and get the audience thinking about where you are and just do a quick self-check. I don't know how much everyone here really has put in terms of effort into cybersecurity governance thus far. So this is just a very surface level scale that you can look at, level 1 to level 5. Level 1 being that you've just started thinking about cybersecurity, you use technology for everyday business operations, and level 5 being the names and addresses of all the Russian and Chinese cyber warfare specialists. So just think about that, level 1 to 5. we'll go through a couple of different components of a framework, and we can kind of reference back and do a check later. So as we'll go through this presentation first, just going to talk about a couple points of governance, a couple points related to compliance, and then we would do questions, but unfortunately not today. So just setting some ground here for what cybersecurity governance actually is. You run your business every day, and you think about the risks related to that business in all contexts. Cybersecurity governance is just adding in the cyber component to your overall enterprise risk management and operations strategy. So two important factors there to think about. One is going to be what, for you, is cyberspace. So that's going to be the hardware that you utilize, the software that you utilize. That's going to be the people that are responsible for managing those tools and that handle those responsibilities. And the second thing to think about is the adversaries that you actually face. At this point, everyone is at risk, especially with ransomware. You've seen attacks on businesses of all sizes. I know some of the more popular or well-publicized events are larger companies that have higher dollar value assets, but everyone is at risk and everyone needs to take some consideration here regarding their cyber governance. So what we're going to do today is just go through a framework from MITRE. They're a systems engineering company. You don't need to know too much about the company itself, but they created this framework that they call Cyber Prep, and the specific subcomponent of that related to cyber governance goes over a few buckets here. So strategic integration, what disciplines are related to cyber, risk mitigation, agility, adaptability, senior engagement, and cyber risk analytics. Within those subcomponents, we're going to work on kind of a sliding scale here just to get you thinking on where you stand within those buckets. So level 1, these are their words from MITRE, level 1 just being a perimeter defense, and level 5 being pervasive agility, meaning that you're ready on the fly to adapt to any threat and taking proactive measures. And you'll see that kind of just general mindset in all of the buckets as we talk about them here. So point number 1, or bucket number 1, is going to be strategic integration. So some key things to think about here is you have strategic planning for all elements of your business. Strategic integration here is just how cybersecurity planning ties into all of that. You can go through and look at levels 1 through level 5 here. I won't go through and explain all of the levels and the wording here. This is directly from MITRE's framework. So we'll reference that at the end, and you'll be able to go through and read it cover to cover. But I'll give you some examples here of what this can look like. So if we're working with third-party vendors to manage any type of business operations, whether it can be a customer relationship management software, it can be a point-of-sale software. This is a component here where you can be in communication with them, seeing what they're doing to handle your data, because once you put it in their hands to manage it, you inherently hand off a little bit of the risk. And something will be good to do is make sure there's communication lines in there so that you have a plan. Another example of this would be if there is some type of ransomware attack that your business suffers, who are you going to call? Is it someone in the staff that's going to make the call? And who is that? Is it going to be the owner of the business? Is it going to be the person that sees the event happen firsthand, and then knowing who to call, whether that's law enforcement, whether that is reaching out to the IT vendor that is related to the entry point or the attack vector for the specific event. And then do you have backup plans for loss of function of any type of business operation? If your point of sale software goes down and you need that on a day-to-day basis to make sales, what's your backup plan? Are you going to be able to take payments and write down transactions on paper and put it back into the system later on? Is it just going to completely shut down your ability to make sales in the moment? Some considerations there that where you can tie in these cybersecurity related points into your overall business plan, your enterprise plan overall. Second bucket here is allied disciplines, and this is related to or closely related to strategic integration. But the difference is that strategic integration is strategy, allied disciplines is operations. So how well are the different departments within your organization aligned with each other to control some of these cybersecurity risks? We'll go through some examples here. So one example of a connection between physical and cybersecurity would be, what's your policy on if you give out devices to your employees? Are they allowed to bring those devices home? Are they allowed to connect those devices to any network that they see fit? Or are they required to take those laptops and put them in a lockbox when they leave the office so that no one can access the computers, not even the employees, but they're protected in the office after hours? Another example of connection between physical and cybersecurity would be having your networks mapped and written down or mapped in some form, some shape or form, including the connections to security cameras. So that is your allied disciplines of physical and cybersecurity. Another example would be, we're talking about small business environments here. If there's one person or a small amount of people that are wearing a lot of hats, handling a lot of different responsibilities, we live in a day and age now where that person could be out of the office, not available at the snap of a finger, and someone else needs to have that information so that if a risk pops up, they're able to handle it. So the element of information sharing between departments so that there aren't those single points of failure if one person or two people are not reachable. Next bucket we'll talk about is cyber risk mitigation. So the real sliding scale here from levels 1 to 5 is going to be how you approach compliance. So we'll talk about compliance in the second half or the end of this presentation more in depth, but this really is level 1. You know the standards you need to comply to, or you pick a set of standards that might be related to your specific, the specific type of business that you run, payment card, or just general data protection regulations that you're required to meet, or just general good practice cybersecurity measures. So level 1 is, I'm just going to choose to be compliant with a set of standards. Level 5 is a little bit more proactive, where you're meeting those standards but then going above and beyond to implement state-of-the-art new technologies and recognizing that the threat environment is constantly evolving and you're keeping up or staying ahead of what you see out there. So some examples here would be performing so a regular compliance check, and that can be on however often that you want it to be. It could be a small compliance check weekly, it could be monthly, quarterly, yearly, whatever you want it to be. And with that, the longer you go without checking in on how you're stacking up compared to certain measures, the more you risk a new threat coming up without addressing the necessary adjustments. Another example would be purchasing some tools. That's always a strategy that people will take, and having the right people to manage those tools is going to be key. Inventorying your assets, simply knowing what you have out there. An example of this would be your employee device policy. Do you give your employees devices to use where you can configure the settings for those devices? Or are they bringing their own devices into the office and bringing them home? Even if they're doing that, it would be good to know that if there is some type of ransomware attack or cybersecurity incident, one thing that people are going to help you out at, one thing that they're going to want to know is who's connected to the network and how could have someone gotten in. So just knowing that ahead of time is going to help you reduce the time to fix an issue if it comes up. So the next bucket we'll talk about is adaptability and agility. The sliding scale here is going to be you're making decisions ad hoc, on the fly. You don't have a plan ahead of time, and something comes up and you just say, I'm going to do this. Level 5 is you have a plan, you have exercised that plan, and most likely you've implemented it or used that plan in practice at least once or multiple times. So everyone in the organization is on the same page and ready to go in the case something pops up again. So some examples of this and how you can improve in that measure. So who's going to be in charge of what we'll call incident command in the event of some type of attack, in the event of some type of threat? Is it going to be the owner of the business? If you have depending on how large or small your small business is, it might be 3 people who you're working with to communicate how we're going to take this on. It could be more. And so just knowing who's going to be in charge of making decisions is going to be key to efficiently moving through that process in the event of any type of attack. This is related to that next point there on procedures. If you're not able to handle payments, who makes the decisions on how you adapt to that? How smooth is that? And is someone who is maybe a lower level employee allowed to make a decision if they see it's going to solve the problem? And is that communicated ahead of time? So having some communication plans in place here that make it so your organization as a whole is able to adapt and make decisions, not on the fly because you don't have a plan, but on the fly because you've communicated and you have plans in place ahead of time. Another example here, last thing I'll talk about, and this is something that's happened for most of the companies that I've worked for, is at some point there's going to be a Wi-Fi outage. If it's 5 minutes or 5 hours, obviously you want to have continued connection forever and eternity, but that's just not how it works. And sometimes there's going to be an outage. Are you able to continue to operate through that, depending on what type of business you run? If you're in an office setting and you rely on Wi-Fi for your communications with partners and having meetings with people that aren't in the same location, obviously that happens a lot of time nowadays. Having a plan to operate through that so that it's smooth and efficient. Next bucket we'll talk about, and this one and one more here, is going to be senior engagement. So this is a little bit more prevalent or I would say necessary for larger businesses because there's more separation between the top and the bottom of the organizational chart, but for smaller businesses, it still is important to know who is involved in the decision making here and how high up the chain that decision making goes. So level one here being you've got a program manager or your person who takes the brunt of the responsibilities for a specific, for a very specific responsibility and is not higher up on the organizational chart. Level 5 being the owner or the CEO is constantly involved in decision making, is appraised on different components of your cybersecurity situation, whether that be purchasing or incidents that happen. So some examples here would be, if you outsource your IT needs, who's in contact with that group? Is it just the member of your staff that is using that the services from that vendor, or is it going to be the owner that's in constant communication, or is it some balance of the two? How often does your internal IT or cyber staff have meetings with higher ups? And again, that separation is going to depend really on how large the business is as a whole. How regular are those meetings that the higher ups in the organization, the executives, the owner, knows what's happening at a lower level in terms of operations? And then if there are purchasing decisions that need to be made or operational decisions on a day-to-day basis, how high up does that need to go in order to get approval? Does it need to go to the owner? Does it need to go to a manager? How high up does that need to go? And that's something to consider. And that's going to be dependent on your specifics as an organization. If you have a similar setup for other decision-making processes in other business functions, then it probably would be good to pick something like that and apply it here. If you haven't considered how those decision-making processes are worked out, good opportunity to do that. So last bucket we'll talk about when we're working through governance is going to be cyber risk analytics. So the key here and really the difference between level 1 and level 5, or just how much you're tackling this, is going to be how often you're doing some type of analytics and the intensity or depth of that analysis. So we'll go to some examples here. Example 1 is, you're performing some type of periodic vulnerability assessment. Are you doing that once every 5 years, once every year, once every quarter? For organizations that have higher value assets that they're handling, higher value data that they're handling, it's probably going to be good to look at these things on a more frequent basis so that you're keeping up with the threat environment. It also depends on the tools that you have at your disposal. Are you able to constantly monitor what's going on, or are you relying on outside sources? That obviously is going to depend on your budget and what you're working with there, but just knowing what you plan to do, how often you plan to do some type of analysis on your risk, and where you plan to get that information, whether it's going to be from internal sources, whether it's going to be from your, as an example, from your IT vendor if you outsource that need, or if it's going to be from publicly available information through different cybersecurity related training and education platforms, or those types of resources. So take it back to that original, just very arbitrary scale that we talked about at the beginning of this section. This is really not obviously not a formal cybersecurity assessment. This is just something to get your brains thinking about where you are in context to other organizations. That as you go through those slides, levels 1 through 5, if you constantly found yourself at a 1 or a 2, that's going to put you here in the I haven't thought about it at all, or I'm just starting to think about it. And so this gives you some context there. One key point to make is that, and I'm going to, already said this once, I'll repeat it again, it's all dependent on your organization's specific risks. I can't make a blanket statement on what everyone is at risk for or what everybody has at their disposal. And so you have to determine as an organization what is your risk appetite? What are you willing to risk to not spend money? What are you willing to go for while spending money, and how are you going to manage making sure that investment is worth it? All right, so we'll move on to second part of the presentation, which is going to be on compliance. So I'm going to keep this relatively short. There are tons of different standards out there that you'll need to, depending on your organization, that you need to comply to. Knowing what those are and knowing how you need to stay compliant is going to be key. So, if you guys were here in person, I'd be asking what some of you are going through on a day-to-day basis, what type of standards we're looking at here, what type of compliance regulations we're looking at here. Some things to consider is if you haven't stepped foot into the realm of sticking to some type of regulatory standards, how often are you required to perform some type of assessment? Who within your organization is going through that assessment process, or are you outsourcing that need and looking for a vendor to come in and perform that assessment because your staff is consistently busy with their regular day-to-day jobs, and you're not an IT or cyber company and you just want someone to handle that for you. And then do you perform some type of assessment for other business functions? Do you have any environmental regulations that you need to comply to? How does your organization handle that? You probably want to take some lessons learned from that experience and apply that to this realm here in terms of sticking to some type of compliance standard. So some common examples here that you might have seen or you might already know that you need to stick to. HIPAA being a big topic nowadays, general data protection. If you are a federal agency, you need to stick with a specific set of standards. There's more than there are on this list. There are more sets of standards, but if you already are complying, you already know what you need to do. If you don't know yet, it's probably good to find out. So when you're thinking about the process of compliance, you got to pick some way to assess yourself, perform the assessment, make the necessary changes, reassess, and repeat this consistently over time. This is going to depend on how often you need to perform those assessments, whether it's on a quarterly, annually, biannual basis. Keep that in mind here. The key component here is you got to know who is going to be doing those assessments within your organization. Is it going to be someone outside your organization that's coming in to do it? And just staying in communication throughout that process. So I'm not going to suggest a specific vendor today or pitch a certain option there. What I am going to explain, and this is because it is an open source tool, is the Center for Internet Security CSAT assessment and the Center for Internet Security Top 18 controls. And this is just an option to get you introduced to the process of picking some standards and assessing yourself against them over time. So this is all of the different frameworks that make up cybersecurity controls from looking at some of them, they all say the same thing in different ways, and some of them have more of an emphasis on one over the other, and that really is dependent on the type of compliance standard that it is. If you're working in finance, obviously there's going to be more strict controls in that realm, as an example. So the CIS top 18 controls, the way they break this down is into 3 what they call implementation groups. So you'll have IG1, IG2, and IG3, where implementation group 1 is basic cyber hygiene. And I'll say I'm not going to explain all these controls. That would be way outside the scope of this presentation. But I will say that in terms of starting the process of staying compliant to some type of standards, this is a good framework for how to approach that. So the way that they break down all of these standards, and if you're new to cybersecurity controls, this slide is probably going to be quite intimidating, but I'll break it down here for you. I just want to pitch this as an option to you to where you can look. It's free on Center for Internet Security's website. It'll be a good start for you. So within each of these controls, you can see the 18 controls and their names listed on the slide here. We'll go just as an example with control number 1. So inventory and control of enterprise assets. That's on a surface level having an inventory of all of the assets, hardware, software, and people that you control within the environment. You can see IG1, IG2, and IG3 listed there right under as what they're calling safeguards or subcontrols, whatever you want to call it. So IG1, in this specific subcontrol, 2 out of the 5 controls or subcontrols within that control are related to IG1, 4 out of 5 IG2, and 5 out of 5 IG3. So the way this is breaking it down is if you, instead of, I'm going to pick 6 of these controls and just only focus on these 6, then the next year I'm going to focus on the next 6, the next year I'm going to focus on the last 6. What that puts you at risk for is if you only focus on 6 of these topics, then you're going to just be completely avoiding the other 12. And so having these implementation groups of, okay, we're going to focus on the basic level of all 18, tackle all of that, then go to the next level of all 18, then the final level of all 18, that's how they break this down. And I really like that process because it keeps you thinking about all aspects of cybersecurity and not just a few. So this is an example dashboard here. If you go onto and you search for the Center for Internet Security, the CSAT assessment, you'll see this dashboard here after you're able to get access and log in, which is again, a free option for you. You're going to see all of the controls listed. It gives you a dashboard of your, once you do the actual assessment, which measures you against all of those 18 controls, your maturity level in all of those 18 controls. You can see where your strengths and weaknesses are. And from here, operationally is the important part for you, which is, okay, now I know that I need to stay compliant with this set of standards, or I need to meet this benchmark and improve on this over time. What do I do next? I know what I'm not good at, but how do I actually solve that problem? And if your business is not in cyber or in IT, and you're focused pretty much solely day to day on running your business, then you're not going to have time to do all of this at once. So the thing that I'll stress is that what you want to do is pick 1 or 2 things to handle at a time, have a tight scope for a project to improve it, and don't go in over your heads and try to say, I'm going to be the most secure organization in Colorado or in the United States or whatever it is right off the bat. Tightly scoped, manageable projects consecutively over time, and this tool or other compliance tools, you'll be able to track your progress over time and see that, okay, today I have these weaknesses. A year from now, 2 years from now, I've made these changes. I can see how that's improved my posture. And you can track that progress over time using this. Or if you choose to go with a different route, you can pick a vendor to do so. That's going to wrap up the presentation today. So wish I could take some questions, but that's going to be it for today.